there aren't going to be any silver bullets today. There aren't going to be any aha moments to say, well, God, if we just did that, we could transform the way we kind of do things. But it is about all these little kind of incremental gains and so on that have the potential to make things better. And as part of that, then I'm also going to talk about relationship management, okay, and the various relationships that the secretary actually has within and without the organization, and how the management of those relationships effectively can really kind of help with performance as well. So that's kind of the structure. So I'm going to begin here with a quote that you can have a look at as I'm setting the scene. And without getting into kind of too much detail, there was a really important company law case back in the late 1880s, where the secretary of the company was deemed to have bound the company to a contract. And this was the withering kind of assessment of the Chief Justice at that time about the role of the secretary. Okay, where essentially the secretary was a clerk, okay, who did what he was told, and it was always going to be he because there were no women in these positions at the time. You know, and essentially that this was a kind of a servant role and a servile role, okay, and I'll talk about the difference between those a little bit later on, okay. And obviously what has happened in the meantime then is that the role of the secretary has completely transformed. So this kind of case was a really important precedent for very many years, and any lawyers on the call may be familiar with it. But then the thinking kind of evolved to a point in more recent years where the secretary kind of became an officer of the board, you know, in some quarters described as the chief administrative officer. So a sea change in the significance kind of the role. So what does the role look like today then? So I'm going to frame it in the beginning by talking about kind of the dual responsibilities that a secretary might have. And there are legal responsibilities that go with the job. And then potentially there may also be some management responsibilities. So depending on the size of the organization, the board or company secretary role can be a full-time role. In the sense that the individual doing the job, that might be everything that they do. You know, if you have many tens of companies or hundreds of companies within your corporate structure, you know, there's a huge administrative burden simply keeping tabs on everything that's kind of going on. And in other situations, then the secretary may also be the finance director, or the way the finance director might see it, the finance director may also be the secretary. You know, very often the secretary will also kind of be the general counsel or the head of legal services. They may have a corporate affairs responsibility. In some situations, they might deal with things like health and safety or IT or facilities or data protection. And in a public sector context, they may also be the freedom of information officer or the person who deals with access to environmental information requests. So there isn't a single kind of blueprint that you can point to and say, well, this is the company secretary role. But typically it will have some kind of legal responsibilities and some kind of management responsibilities. But also then, in terms of the attributes, you know, the secretary has to be a counselor, okay, to be able to kind of provide advice, which sometimes might be legal advice, but otherwise it might be more kind of common sense type advice. And I'm going to tell you a few stories later on. The secretary has to be a representative for the board when the board is not present. And I'll explain what I mean about that later on too. Secretary has to be a diplomat, because sometimes you might find yourself in a situation where there's kind of conflict or tension. Has to be a scribe. So the one thing the secretary needs to be able to do is to write, okay? So whether we're talking about writing kind of a letter on behalf of the chairperson, or we're talking about writing the minutes of a meeting, the ability to kind of capture things succinctly is a very important skill. As we've seen, the secretary may also be kind of the organization's legal advisor. And in this sense, I mean, it may be that somebody is suitably qualified as a solicitor or barrister or some other kind of legal qualification. But it may also be that even without those qualifications, the secretary would be expected to have a good working knowledge of the law relating to the particular company or the sector in which the company operates. There's often a social function to the secretary role, insofar as, you know, if the board is going to have a couple of days away to consider strategy, or the board is going to meet for dinner a couple of times a year, or whatever it might be, it will often fall to the board secretary to organize that. And finally, the board secretary is also potentially a historian, because my own view is that, you know, the records of board meetings and so on provide a really important record of important developments in the history of a company. And even when it comes to things like writing minutes, we need to have a view to that as well. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. So moving on then to but when you take all of these kind of things together, okay, I mean, ultimately, the secretary needs to be effective, needs to be a trusted advisor. Okay, and by a trusted advisor, I mean somebody who's kind of trusted by the board and trusted by the management, because the secretary is very often at that interface between the board and the executive. And I'll talk about that interface and the issues that it gives rise and the management of those issues kind of a little bit later on. So while your starting point might be, you know, as a secretary or as somebody who's thinking about that even from a career point of view, yes, I need to understand the legal responsibilities. And yes, you can be a really good secretary by understanding the legal responsibilities and discharging those functions well. But if you really want to add very significant value to the performance of your board and the performance of your company, in my experience, it's about the soft skills, okay, and about those other attributes and so on that we bring to bear. And I'm going to talk about those as we go through. So I'm going to touch really briefly on the legal responsibilities of the secretary, because as I've just said a minute ago, that's not really the focus today. So my kind of starting point, I suppose, here is that if you already employ a company secretary, or if you are the company secretary, you know, the likelihood is that you are, you know, you're going to have a basic understanding of company law. You're going to know how to file the returns in the company's office. You know, you're going to know how to prepare an agenda for a board meeting, and, you know, what functional minutes of a meeting and so on might look like, and all of those kinds of things, right? So I'm taking kind of that as a given, really, for the purposes of this call. And the only point I really want to make here, I suppose, is that as the secretary, you know, you need to understand, obviously, your own responsibilities kind of in the middle, but also then, because in fact, you know, the board and the executive will look to the secretary to help them to navigate this landscape. So if you're a company, you know, having a functioning understanding of company law is very important. But then if you're operating in the not-for-profit sector, you know, you will also need to have an appreciation of charity law. Very often, the secretary will be charged with educating kind of directors. So you need to understand the director's responsibilities and how they are separate from the responsibilities of the company, because the company has legal responsibilities, but individually, the directors also have responsibilities. And depending on what sector you operate in, there might be different kind of codes of governance applicable in that sector, or the funding agencies in that sector may have different regulations. So, you know, to be able to perform kind of the company secretary role at the first level, we need to have a good understanding kind of all of this. But as I said, I'm kind of taking that as a given for today. And what I want to do then is look at the distinction between somebody who can do all of that, and then there's somebody who has the X factor, who can bring something new and extra to the table, which enhances the performance of the board, but also then potentially provides much greater job satisfaction for the person kind of doing the work. And I'm going to come at this from two perspectives. I'm going to look at it from a technical perspective, you know, the actual nuts and bolts of kind of doing the job. And then I'm going to look at it from a relationship perspective. So first of all, the technical perspective, then I'm going to look first of all at kind of at planning the board agenda. Okay. So the responsibility for planning kind of the board's work falls between the chair, the CEO and the secretary. And depending on the style of the chair and the relationship with the CEO and all of that type of thing, there are a number of kind of different ways in which this could actually be done. So one of the things that as a secretary, I need to figure out is what's expected of me vis-a-vis the respective responsibilities of the chair and the CEO. What's expected of me when it comes to planning the board agenda? From a planning point of view, then, there's a couple of dimensions to this. So the first part of it is the annual planning piece. So what does the cycle of meetings and so on look like? And then there's the detail of on a meeting by meeting basis. So typically what we're trying to do is we're trying to agree dates in the autumn, say for the following year, because particularly in a situation where if you have maybe a number of non-executive directors on your board, typically non-executive directors may serve on more than one board. So the whole idea of trying to facilitate them by having kind of good advanced planning is kind of really important. And in effect, what we're trying to do then is create a master calendar. Okay, so, and the master calendar would include, say, when the main kind of company board is going to meet, or the main NGO board, or whatever the nature of the organization is. If there are subsidiary boards that need to meet before the board meets, and if there are board committees that need to meet before the board meets. So if we're going to have, say, an audit committee and a nominations committee, or a HR committee or a strategy committee, or whatever it is, we need to facilitate all of those those units within the company kind of to do their work by putting kind of a proper master plan or master calendar together. What we also need to do then is we need to pencil in the standing and recurring items early. So for example, if we know that we're likely to approve our accounts in April, we need to make provision for the audit committee and for the board to meet kind of during that time. If we know that we have a statutory requirement to do to receive a report on health and safety performance at least once a year, and we decide we're putting that in for October. So the more visibility we have of these kind of standing items, or these recurring items, then the more information we have around how we can use the other meetings, okay, and particularly how we can make time for conversations around strategy. Okay. And the next point I'm making here, I talk about creating kind of a rhythm and flow. And what I mean by that is that the organization of the board and subsidiary boards and committee meetings, and then the alignment of those, say, with meetings of the executive or the management team, when that is flowing properly, okay, it creates a tremendous momentum. Okay, so we have a rhythm to this whereby we know there's a board meeting in 4 weeks' time. Okay, management is geared up for this and they're preparing their papers and having them ready. The board meets, the actions are agreed, the actions are implemented, and we get into a rhythm whereby kind of business is kind of progressed on a really kind of systematic basis. And this can be really motivational when people can see that the benefit of the executive can see the benefit of their work coming forward, the board making decisions, the board making decisions about strategy, and then seeing the progress and all of that. So trying to create a rhythm and a flow where the board meeting is not some kind of a once a month event that we all have to show up for, but where the board meeting is fully integrated into the workings of the business. It's really important then that when we're planning the board agenda that we maintain the focus on strategy, okay, and we make time to think about strategy and to review progress against strategy. The role of the board should be to look up and out, not down and in. Okay, so if you're going to use an optical instrument, the board should be using a periscope, not a microscope. Okay, the board's job is to scan the horizon, to know what's happening in terms of the external environment and to bring kind of that thinking in. and not to be, looking down into the detail of the organization, which is something that boards sometimes do. They can be very busy, they can appear to be very diligent, but if I spend a huge amount of time looking at last month's management accounts, there may be some value in that, but the reality is that it's only the lessons that I'm extracting from that is value, because I can't change what happened in the past. What I can do is change the future. It's also really important when we're planning the board agenda that we make time and space for reflection. Okay, the agenda can't be jam-packed all the time, okay, because what happens in that particular case then is we all end up being busy fools. Okay, we have a 4-hour board meeting, we've got 17 items on the agenda, we go bang, 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 bang. But at the end of the meeting, we have to ask ourselves, did we actually add value in terms of the organization and its strategic objectives over that time? And when we're thinking about making space, then we also need to recognize that, boards and executives are kind of complex kind of social systems, right? And we need to make space to develop personal relationships, not necessarily friendships, but that people understand each other. And this can't happen when the board meetings are just kind of so jammed packed with minutiae that there isn't scope to kind of take a step back. Okay, so some kind of pointers there about kind of planning the board agenda. Just to look at that in a kind of a little bit more detail then. So this is kind of a typical board agenda, and I just want to bring out a few points here. So the first point I want to bring out is the need for us from an ethics point of view and from a governance point of view to make kind of declaration of conflicts of interest a standing item on our agenda. Okay. Then making sure that we've got follow through from our previous meeting by ensuring that previously agreed actions have been implemented. Then making sure that we're reserving kind of prime time for approval and decision items. Okay, so very often what can actually happen is that, we start off the meeting, we look at the minutes, we look at what happened since the last meeting, we hear from the CEO, we hear from the finance director, we move the accounts. And we're 2.5 or 3 hours into the meeting and people are starting to get tired. And particularly, if this is a voluntary board and perhaps it's meeting in the evening time, and all of a sudden we're being asked to consider an important kind of strategic issue. Okay, so it's very important that when we're structuring our board meetings that we make sure the important items come up front when people are fresh and they have time to reflect this, and that if the time is going to get squeezed in a meeting, let's make sure it's squeezed when we're dealing with things that can genuinely be taken as read, rather than things that are of kind of strategic kind of importance. Okay. Let's allocate time to match the complexity of each item, right? So that we know if the meeting is going to be for 2 hours or going to be for 1 hour, or whatever it might actually be, that we're apportioning the time at the meeting according to the importance of the items kind of under discussion. And then kind of finally, we will often have a situation where we have a number of items on our board agenda where these items are for noting and where they have been kind of read in advance. Now, I'll talk a little bit about this whole idea of taking things as read in just a few moments. So when it comes then to preparing kind of board papers, so now we've got our plan for the year, we've got a plan for a specific meeting, and now we're talking about preparing the papers for that meeting. So look, obviously papers for a board meeting will come from different departments, okay? And there's a few schools of thought and so on around this. One is that individual departments or individual authors need to own their own board papers, and of course they do. But in my view, the secretary can have an important role in ensuring kind of quality and consistency and clarity, so that the entire pack of papers, is unified, okay, and is consistent in its look and feel and in its approach. So quite apart from, the papers kind of looking visually attractive and whatever else, from my point of view, one of the core issues around being consistent across board papers is that it's really important, I believe, for management to be kind of signaling unity to the board. Okay, so if you have a situation whereby a particular department, insists on using a different font to everybody else, or insists on presenting their presentations and so on in a different way, for me, that's a bit of a red flag. Okay, it actually suggests that maybe, you don't have a collective sense of ownership of whatever that department is talking about. Okay, and so I think these kinds of signals are actually really important. So, using kind of standard templates, then, you may have your own kind of brand guidelines within the organization, but it's very important, as we'll see in a minute, that we distinguish between items where the board is going to be asked to make a decision. I might want, if I'm the CEO, I might want the board to consider something now. I might want to get their input. I might want to get their initial thoughts with a view to bringing something back for decision later on. It may be that I want the board to be aware of something, okay? And therefore, but making that distinction is really important for reasons I'll come to in just a moment. So the way in which we kind of make it clear to the board then about how we, what we require from the board is with the cover page that we use, or the summary sheet that we might use with the board paper. And I'll show you an example of that in just a moment. And the other really important kind of role that the secretary can play is, because the secretary is present at each board meeting, they have a really good, or should have a really good, appreciation of what the board's expectations might be. Okay, so they know what the things that the board is generally happy about. They know the things that the board, typically will have questions about. They know the things that are likely to annoy the board if something is presented in a particular way. So the secretary can play a really important role in moderating what's going to be sent or presented kind of to the board. So back to this point then about the board paper and the presentation of it to the board. Okay, so I'm posing a kind of question here. So if I'm a director and I'm receiving a board paper, okay, the question I'm asking myself is, what's this paper for? Okay, now that's a different question than what's this paper about. Okay, so what it's about is, what's the subject? So the subject is a proposed investment in a new warehouse. Okay, but as a director, my whole approach to how I will read the paper will be colored by, so what's the paper for? Okay, so I'm just using an example here of where a really simple device that you can have on the front page of your board papers, where you identify the subject, you talk about what's the board being asked to do here. Okay, so the board has been asked to make a decision. There's a summary of the decision that the board is being, or the context for the decision, and then there's a simple description of the decision that's being sought from the board. And I can't overestimate just the value of this, because if you're sitting at a board meeting and you receive a 24-page document or a 50-page document, the business case for X, Y, or Z, it's extraordinarily frustrating to be 10 or 12 pages into reading that document and only then to realize, hold on a second, we're going to be asked to make a decision about this at the next board meeting. Okay, the way in which I will approach the reading of the document is completely different if I'm reading something for my general information, or if I'm reading it with a view to being asked to make a decision. Okay, so again, this is another one of these 1%. There are no silver bullets in here. What there are small kind of incremental improvements that you can potentially make. So we've created our agenda. We have decided what's for decision and what's for noting. We've issued the papers to our board and we're preparing for the board meeting. Okay, so different boards and different organizations have different approaches to making presentations at board meetings. Okay, so my, suppose, kind of simple rules around this would be as follows. So first of all, you know, the board paper should be self-explanatory. Okay, so if I get a board paper before a meeting, it should be crystal clear to me, what's this about? What are we going to be asked to do? You know, what are the implications of making this decision, etc., etc. And you know, part of my responsibility as a director is to have read that in advance and be prepared. Okay, and the chair needs to really kind of enforce that, because sometimes what actually happens is that if somebody knows that the details are going to be presented in full again at a board meeting, that allows us to cop out and say, actually, you know what, I'm not going to read this because I'm going to be told all about it at the board meeting. Okay, so if I'm an executive and I've spent 6 months working on something, which is culminating on this proposal coming before the board, it's very tempting to want to show all of my work. Okay, I want to show you the site plans. I want to show you all the investigations that we did. I want to show you the results of all of the consultations with the customers. Okay. Because, you know, I've put a hell of a lot of work into this and I really want everybody to know that. Okay, but that's not what the purpose of bringing this to the board is. Okay, so it's really important that when you think about it in you know, like in examinations, if you like, what you're trying to do here is to display the answer that you have got from all of the work that you've done, not the detailed calculations and so on that went behind that. So if we're going to have a presentation then at a board meeting, okay, the purpose of that presentation should be to frame the board discussion. Okay, so the board has received the documentation. Now what we want to do is tee this up so that the board can have a good discussion and challenge and support or whatever it might be around the proposal that's actually presented. And that presentation might address briefly context of why is management proposing this course of action, or why is a board committee proposing this course of action? What are the implications if we do this or we don't do it? Okay, and that then speaks to things like risk and so on as well. And then precisely what decision is being sought and what action will happen as a result of this. So if as a director, I decide or I contribute to a decision to approve this, what's going to happen? And where that is also then kind of very helpful from a secretary's point of view is that the more precisely we present the decision to the board, the easier it is to record that decision in the minutes. Okay, so effectively, if the board papers are properly presented, the minutes should almost write themselves. Okay, and I'll come to the issue of minutes in just a moment. So taking the minutes of a meeting, again, you know, a wide range of different approaches and so on here. You know, I've attended board meetings where effectively the minutes have been pretty much a verbatim record of everything that was said at the meeting. And then at the other end of the scale, I've seen minutes which are just the bare bones record of the decisions that were taken with no context, no color, just simply the board decided to invest €3 million in the warehouse that you saw on the previous page. So as a minimum, what we need to do is record, well, so who was there, you know, where and when did the meeting take place? We need to distinguish between the board members who are present and others who are in attendance at the meeting. We need to record any conflicts of interest that may have been declared. You know, we obviously need to record decisions that were taken and actions that were arising. And I would recommend that in addition to having your minutes, what you have is a rolling kind of action log where all of the decisions taken are the actions flowing from those decisions are recorded. And then we have an easy reference as to the progress made in implementing those actions since the last meeting. It's important that we record any dissenting views. So if the board may well have decided to invest in this warehouse, but a particular director may have opposed that and may request that his view or her view is dissenting view is recorded. And then, you know, the minutes also capture then, perhaps in summary, other items that were presented for information and noted by the board. You know, three things I think just further points are worth making. One is that going back to my point a moment ago, the clearer the proposition that is put to the board, okay, what exactly is the board being asked to decide, the easier it is to write the minutes. Okay, so that is an added incentive for any secretary to actually exercise some control over the quality of board papers, because it really makes your job so much easier to do. In my opinion, and it is only an opinion, providing some context and color is really important. Okay, so if I simply include a sentence which says the board decided to invest €3 million in a warehouse, when I look back on that in 6 months' time or 12 months' time or 5 years' time, without some context which says, we were experiencing customer service difficulties at the time, or we wanted to open up a new market opportunity, or whatever it might be, so we're striving for balance here. We need to give a sense of the context in which the board made a decision, but without getting into John said this and Abdul said that and Mary said something completely different. Ultimately the real skill in minute taking is to distill all of that and summarize the context, a little bit of the color, and then the decision that was actually taken. The reference here to minutes in set formats is that, so sometimes you may need to deviate from the process that you normally use to take your minutes, because, so for example, if you're raising new bank facilities or a new line of credit and so on with your bank, the likelihood is that the bank's lawyers will be very specific about the format of the minutes that they would require around that particular board decision. And that's what I'm referring to there. And the other point I want to make here is that, and this goes back to an observation early in the session about the role of the secretary as a historian. Okay, the minutes of a board meeting, serve a purpose today, which is around so what board, it's a functional thing about, well, what does the board actually decide to do, and what action are we going to take as a result, right? But also, I would be really mindful when I'm writing the minutes of a board meeting that I'm also writing a really important part of the social history of the organization. Who was there when the decision was taken? What was the context? Why did we decide to build that warehouse, or whatever the case may be? Okay, and I think if we think about the current period and the decisions that boards are having to make and whatever else, like understanding the context in which all of that happened, I think is very important. And so whether you are a family business or, so you can imagine a situation where your company reaches its 50th anniversary or reaches its centenary, and you bring in somebody to write the history of the organization. Isn't it so important to know that, well, so why did my grandfather make that decision? Why did we decide to build the factory in Birmingham rather than Leeds, or whatever the case may actually be? So it's not to over egg that, but I suppose my advice here is not to err too much in the direction of the minutes just being about recording the decisions and the decisions only. Okay, there's a slightly broader context here, which sometimes is difficult to think about when we're busy and we're working at the meeting and all that kind of goes with that. Just as an aside, then, I just want to make reference to the fact that I'm talking about board papers and board packs. Like, increasingly, organizations are moving towards having kind of digital board papers, and there's lots of products and so on out there. But I think it's something that, if you haven't looked at it already, I would really encourage you kind of to think about using kind of a board portal and so on as a way of kind of distributing your board papers and making your reference material and so on available to your board. But as I said, that's really kind of an aside from today's topic. So, hopefully over the past 4 or 5 slides, you've picked up a few little kind of tips and tricks, about how you can actually improve the kind of the functioning of the board meeting, right? But like, ultimately, as I said earlier on, you know, a board and the executive is about relationships, okay, and you know, lots of people have roles to play in the relationship between the board and the executive, not least the CEO and the chair. But I do want to talk a little bit about how you as a secretary can contribute to this as well. So look, here we have a really simple representation of a kind of two entities, I suppose, within an organization. So on the right hand side, we have our board of directors, and we have the chair obviously as the leader of that board. And on the left hand side, we've got our executive team led by the CEO. So in this model here, okay, like the directors are non-executive directors, as would be the case, say, in the voluntary sector, or certainly in the case of a lot of state boards and so on, where perhaps only the CEO might be a director of the company. But I'm conscious of the fact that obviously in very many companies, you know, half or more of the board may also be made up of executives. So this is a very simple representation here. But what I really wanted to bring out, I suppose, is that so the company secretary may be a member of the executive team, or the company secretary may be, you know, may report to a member of the executive team. But ultimately, they need to have access to the kind of CEO and kind of chair relationship, if you like, to be effective. So if we think about this, excuse me, if we think about the board and the executive, okay, as like a car engine, okay, where there are many moving parts, many kind of different personalities, many different functions and so on to be performed. Excuse me. So my view is that the company secretary is the oil in this machine. Okay, and we know what happens if there's no oil in the engine, right? So my job as a company secretary is to help all of these bits and so on to interact kind of smoothly. So let's look at some of those relationships then, right? So there are kind of, I've highlighted, I suppose, kind of 4 key relationships here, and I'm not going to talk about the 4th one today because it's outside of the scope of the meeting. But from time to time, the secretary may well have responsibilities for dealing with kind of stakeholders, or may have an investor relations type role and so on. But I'm going to talk about the other kind of 3 relationships. So the first one then is when it comes to supporting the chair, right? And I've already kind of talked about kind of work planning, kind of an agenda setting, but now we're into working kind of as a partner and complementing the chair in kind of getting this work done, okay? At the meeting itself, I think the secretary can play a really important role in helping with managing the time, okay, and making sure that we kind of pull back time if some topic is overrunning, or find ways of rejigging the agenda where that might be necessary. I also feel that the secretary has a really important role to play in observing what's going on, in listening actively to the debate that's actually happening, and potentially kind of taking soundings. So, you know, if we have a situation where we have a chair we have a director, for example, who is consistently asking kind of the same question one meeting after the other, and people do have their own kind of pet topics and so on, then understanding why is that? Why is it that he or she seems to be like a dog with a bone on that kind of particular issue, can really help to kind of unlock. And sometimes this persistent questioning on the same topic can be a real source of tension. But for example, if we have somebody who really wants to dig into the detail of the management accounts, which might not be appropriate for a director, you know, understanding that in a previous job, there was a significant fraud, okay, had occurred, would give us a better understanding of why he feels the need to put his hand into the wound, so to speak, on that particular issue. Sorry, I don't know what I actually did there. Actually, I managed to start subtitles for however reason. Okay, there's the unexpected feature I wasn't expecting to discover today. then depending on the chair's preference, okay, and I have a couple of stories that I'm actually, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into, but if through the questions, an opportunity to kind of come back on, but every chair will have their own preference as to how they want the company secretary to operate, okay, and you need to understand the chair's style. So, you know, it may be, for example, that the chair wants to run the show and is fully in control and is really good at sensing what's going on in the room and engaging the mood and all of that. And he really wants you, or she really wants you, to kind of, you know, to keep the minutes, keep the records, keep us on track. That's one thing. I worked with the chair at one point who was very keen that I would actively participate in the meeting. But if I was to actively participate in the meeting where the chair doesn't want me to do that, then, you know, that's a real source of potential kind of difficulty, possibly, okay? And then the other challenge that from time to time you will sometimes have as a secretary is, you know, an issue comes up at the meeting. I know quite a bit about this. I know that what the board is, do I wait to be asked or do I intervene? Okay, and finding that balance and knowing, being able to exercise kind of good judgment is so important. And the other way in which you might be able to support the chair then is in kind of driving action after meetings, you know, writing letters on his or her behalf, etc., etc. So when I was putting this kind of talk together, I asked a few chairs just for their thoughts in relation to, so what are you looking for in a company secretary? And these were some of the observations that actually kind of came back. Okay. So working with the board and individual directors other than the chair, then a few other kind of pieces of advice. And just want to assure Fergal and Ayushi that we're okay for time, right? We will be finished by 2 o'clock, all right? So you're looking a little bit concerned there. So I think, first of all, when it comes to kind of induction, right, the secretary has a really important role to play, okay? So somebody new is joining our board and, you know, we have a job to ensure that he or she understands things, right? So typically kind of induction might come in kind of 3 parts. And a lot depends on who the individual director is and what experience they might actually have. So it may be, for example, that an executive is being promoted to the board, okay? He or she really understands how the business works, how we make money around here, how we deliver impact, etc., etc., but might really have no appreciation of the different role between being kind of a director of the company and being an executive. So in that particular case, the induction might focus on the director's responsibilities. In a different case, I might have a really experienced non-executive director joining my board who is on very numerous boards, really understands her responsibility as a director, but doesn't know how our business works. So again, I would be rebalancing the content of my induction, you know, towards, well, how does this business make money? If it's the case of a not-for-profit organization, so what's the impact we're trying to have and how do we deliver that impact? And then how things work around here is more about kind of culture and values and so on. You know, we can continue then to support individual directors. You know, like every director has kind of strengths and weaknesses, and people don't like to expose their weaknesses. Okay, so nobody is going to put their hand up at a board meeting. Well, maybe some might, but it would be very rare that somebody put their hand up and say, I don't understand FRS 102, or I don't understand this particular accounting treatment, or I don't understand how we arrived at that result. One of the ways in which you can be really helpful to an individual director is if you recognize that that issue is there, or better still, if that person comes to you because you are a trusted advisor, that comes to you and say, look, I'm really struggling with this. And then you can discreetly organize some training or some coaching or some guidance or whatever it might be. The secretary as a back channel to the chair and the CEO can also be really important. Okay, so very quick versions one here. I worked with the chair one time, and when an item was discussed at the board meeting, he had a terrible habit, okay? And the terrible habit was that when the executive was finished giving its presentation, he was always the first in to offer his opinion. Okay, this is what I feel. And that created a real difficulty for some of the other directors then, because they didn't want to appear to be going against the chair. Okay. And a director kind of came to me and said, look, have you noticed how, and I had noticed it, and in fact, I had given the feedback, but it had been missed. And but we were able to kind of go back to the individual and make it clear that actually, you know, the way the chair was behaving, okay, was actually contributing to the board being dysfunctional, right? So the fact that that director could come to me and say, look, Jerry, I don't want to say this to him directly because I'm afraid he might take offense, and finding different ways of kind of getting messages back like that. Another way potentially is about kind of what I call reframing questions. So very often you will have a situation at a board meeting where a director has a concern about something and they're not really, they can't really kind of articulate what it is they're concerned about. So a question can kind of come out, which is maybe not very clear. And then the member of the executive is, you know, doesn't necessarily understand the question. Like if you're really paying attention at the meeting and you don't have to worry about making a presentation, you can really help by being able to say, well, I think what Fergal was getting at there was X, Y, or Z, and help to reframe that question for the other member of the team who's going to kind of address it. A final point on this particular slide then is that I talk here about the secretary being the board's day-to-day representative in the organization. What I mean by that is that particularly in boards that are made up exclusively of non-executive directors, they come to a board meeting, they make their contribution, and then perhaps they're not seen again for a month or for 6 weeks or whatever it might be. It's very easy in that situation for management to incorrectly believe they are responsible for running the business, okay? And it's really important that if the secretary is part of those management discussions, to remind people that look, we've all had a situation where somebody is frustrated because they went to a board meeting and the item that they were proposing wasn't approved. Okay, and it's very easy to sort of say, oh, it's ridiculous, I can't understand, etc., etc. And I personally feel that it's very important in those circumstances that the secretary is able to point out that, in fact, the board has the legal responsibility to run the business. It's their prerogative to say no to something. If they've turned down something you were looking for, you really need to ask yourself the question, why did I not present a better case and so on for this, rather than kind of saying, you know, leaving all of this at the door kind of the board. Supporting executive colleagues then, and I'm going to be quick on this, all right? So because the secretary is a constant presence at the board, okay, whereas you may have some kind of other members of management who might participate in 1 or 2 board meetings in the year, the secretary is in a really good position to be able to advise people about how to kind of approach a board meeting. Okay, you know, what's the right way to pitch the board paper? What's the right level of detail to pitch? Quality control, making sure that the quality control is there. Clarifying the ask. So I've often come across a situation whereby a member of the executive, you know, is thinking about, okay, I know I'm going to need board approval for this, but without really being 100% clear on, you know, so what exactly is the board do I need to ask the board for approval for? Okay, and particularly when it comes to things like financial limits and so on that need to be addressed. Okay. Advising the executive then in relation to tactics. So for example, again, something I've encountered quite regularly would be that where somebody has been working on a project for a number of months, they've had a big team working on it with them, and they want to make sure that the team gets some of the credit. Okay, so they decide we want to bring 7 or 8 people with us to the board meeting because we want the board to recognize the people who've done all of the work in getting us to this point. Okay, very often, you know, while a board will recognize what that individual is trying to do, it can actually really constrict the work of the board if there are so many people in the room that the board doesn't feel free to actually have the conversation. So advising the secretary, advising the executive on the tactics, that, you know what, that might not be such a good idea. I understand why you want to do it, etc., etc. And also then kind of gauging the mood of the meeting, and advising people, actually, well, today, might not be the right day to come in and kind of crack a few jokes, because they're not really geared up for that today. Reviewing board effectiveness, I'm going to kind of pass over, okay, because we all understand the importance, I think, of that. So just a couple of really brief kind of closing comments then. Look, that's been a whistle-stop tour through what I hope is some kind of a mashup of some kind of practical advice about technical things that you can do to improve your own contribution as a secretary and the performance of your board, and also then some of the things from a relationship management point of view that you can do as well. It's very much a personal perspective. There are lots of different ways of kind of doing the job, but these are some things that I've kind of found have worked for me. So if then, as a secretary, you want to be kind of a trusted advisor, what would be some kind of final advice? So first of all, you've got to earn the right to be trusted, okay? Nobody's entitled to be kind of trusted right off the bat. And for me, what that comes down to is a few things. So first of all is, but look, knowing your job and doing it well, that's your kind of starter for 10. And, doing the core job and so on well. And, there's an American kind of expression about don't sweat the small stuff. So, don't worry about the things that you don't control, you can't control. I would say if you're a company secretary, sweat the small stuff, okay? It's the chair's job, it's the CEO's job to look at the big picture, to look at the wider organization, okay? Somebody needs to take care of the details, and that is really kind of appreciated. I talked about respecting and representing the directors when they're not around. If you want to be trusted, give your honest opinion if asked. If the chair says, what do you really think about the way that so-and-so delivered that at the meeting? And then be prepared to tell people what they don't want to hear. Like if an executive colleague goes to a board meeting and really mishandles a situation, telling her she was wonderful is not doing anybody any favors, okay? If you're going to be, in a position whereby you're trusted both by the board and by the executive, you need to be somewhat fearless with your advice, okay? Respecting confidentiality goes without saying. As a secretary, you may get to participate in private board meetings where the executive is not present and so on like that. And inevitably, you will have colleagues coming up to you after the meeting and say, what did they say? What did they say about me? What are they going to do about this? And it's really important that you're able to maintain that boundary if you're going to be kind of a trusted advisor and so on to the board. And the very final point I want to make then is about having kind of a service focus or a service orientation, right? So this is not about being servile, right? I really want to make the distinction, okay? And what I mean here is that your starting position as a secretary needs to be to understand your job is to serve the board, okay? And there's absolutely kind of no shame in that. And if your starting point is there, then you're well on the way from, say, from an attitude point of view and so on, then to earning the position of being kind of a trusted advisor who in turn can significantly enhance the performance of the board. Okay, so look, sorry, that went on a little bit longer than I expected. 35 years experience of kind of doing it, it sort of does that to a person. So sorry if there's a lot and so on there. I know there's quite a good few questions. So I'm going to hand you back to Fergal now, and you can decide, Fergal, even from a time point of view and so on, how you want to deal with the questions that we have. So over to you.
Yeah, sorry there, Jerry. Just before we move on to the questions, we're very short on time now, so I'll be very brief. I'll just give you an update on the diploma. It starts on the 21st of April, designed and taught by highly qualified people such as Jerry to give you the skills and confidence in the boardroom. So if you want more details, please get in touch with me. Also, we have our membership offering available now. So we have a range of tools, case studies, templates, members only, webinars and networking events. So you can gain access to further details on how to sign up on our website, and we'll help you out there. I will just go briefly into the questions and try and answer maybe a couple, Jerry, if you don't mind. We won't be able to get around to all of them, unfortunately, but apologies. Sorry there, it's just gone from me there. I'll just move my way to the back, sorry now. What is your view on the consent agenda items approval that will be read in advance and not discussed?
Yeah, so I think my point about that is that very often when people say we're going to take that as read, okay, it would actually be more honest to say we're going to take that as not read, okay, because like, you know, a lot of the time you get this, you know, people don't read the stuff, right? So my view around that, I suppose, is that I think the chairman or chairperson needs to make it really clear, if that is the practice, then the expectation is that all of the directors will have read the papers. So my view is that, you know, directors have kind of three responsibilities, okay? And they are read up, turn up, and speak up. Okay, and the reading up piece means reading the stuff and so on that is likely to be dealt with, as you say, on a kind of on a consent basis. Yeah.
Brilliant. Is there any difficulty in appointing a secretary who has also a financial management role in your organization?
Well, it's quite common for the finance director potentially to double up as the company secretary. Like I think it's all it all depends on the context, but realistically, I think that the finance director in that context is probably going to be doing a reasonably basic job as company secretary, because he or she is going to have so much to do on the finance side.
This is from Jermud. How does the recording dissenting views stack up against the collective collegial responsibilities of board members?
Yeah, so generally speaking, the way I would kind of deal with it is that you know, I would record the collective decision as one of the board, and I would only record a dissenting view if somebody specifically asked that their view would be recorded.
Okay. Is the secretary always required to attend board meetings, or can she only to prepare for the board meetings without actual attending it?
Well, the secretary is an officer of the board, so it would be quite an unusual thing for me for the secretary kind of not to be there. Whatever about the board deciding, well, we want to have kind of 10 minutes of a private discussion, but it would be very unusual for me for the secretary to be involved in the preparation and not to attend.
This is from Liz. Can recording the minutes be rotated by board members?
Yes.
Okay.
I think having a consistent style is important, though, that it doesn't kind of just change from one month to the next, depending on who happens to be writing them.
Is it necessary for all board members to see and provide their comments, or just the chairman of the board will see and approve the agenda?
I would generally see that you know, it's a matter between kind of the chair and the CEO with support from the secretary to put the agenda together, but any director should be able to propose items for the agenda if he or she wants to.
Is the practice of recording minutes electronically and have them destroyed after the minuting considered illegal?
Well, I think so. Like, for example, this meeting today has been recorded, okay, right? So I think that's becoming more and more kind of common practice. But I think that I don't favor the idea that well, because we have a recording, we don't need to have minutes. I mean, I think we can use the recording as an aide-memoire to help with the writing of the minutes, but ultimately the minutes are an important kind of legal document in their own right.
How appropriate is it for a BOD member to present paper to the BOD to share biz intel for table discussion?
I don't see any issue with that.
Brilliant. How can you avoid a situation where the chair secretary access becomes too powerful on a board?
Okay, I think I suppose there's a few ways of doing that. I mean, one systemic way of doing it is by having kind of regular board evaluations or board effectiveness reviews. And that gives people an opportunity, maybe even anonymously, to talk about how this is becoming kind of an issue. Obviously, the more direct way to deal with that is for any director who feels that that is a concern to seek to raise it, ideally at a private meeting of the board, because it's not necessarily something that needs to be discussed in front of management.
I think maybe one final question here. Ours is a voluntary board. Company secretary appears to be a nominal role, calling AGM, signing off on directorships, etc. CEO's PA acts as a sec to board meetings and works with the chair and CEO to finalize minutes. Is this in order?
Yeah, so I think that like as long as the essential legal company secretary functions are discharged, you know, distributing that work among a number of different people is not like it's maybe less less effective and less efficient, but it's not it's not, what's the word, there's no whole prohibition on that.
Brilliant. Maybe just one final question there and we can wrap things up there, Jerry. Should the board sec be involved in assessing effectiveness on board members, just board as a whole?
I would definitely. I think that when the board is doing kind of a self-evaluation or an effectiveness review, I think getting the input of the CEO and the company secretary, as well as the board directors, is essential.
Fantastic. I think we've a lot more questions there, and I don't think we'll have time to go through them all. So we'll try and cut it now. But thanks so much, Jerry. Fantastic webinar again, and thanks for everyone for attending.